The snow
A single
had begun
clue
just
could
after
change
noon,
everything.
the sort of thick,
I'm Miss
determined
Marple.
fall that turns
Welcome to my
hedgerows
new
into gentle
case.
humps and transforms the ordinary village of St. Mary Mead into something resembling a Christmas card. By 3 o'clock, the village hall smelled of tea and polished wood and the faintly medicinal sweetness of mothballs shaken free from winter coats hastily retrieved from wardrobes. Miss Jane Marple sat in a hard chair near the radiator, her knitting needles moving without hurry, creating delicate patterns in soft blue wool. No one would have noticed that her mild blue eyes took in all the small dramas that accompany a village's attempt at charitable benevolence during the harsh winter months. Mrs. Lydia Parmenter hovered by the trestle table with a spiral notebook, righteous with her carefully prepared lists. She possessed the industrious look of someone who intended to see every pensioner warm through January's bitter grip. "Coal vouchers must be signed for properly, Iris," she murmured, loud enough to be heard by anyone in doubt of her organizational prowess. Iris Bell, a pale young woman with a rose brooch pinned rather askew on her cardigan, nodded and smiled at the growing queue, her sweetness somewhat thin at the edges, like jam spread too sparingly on bread. Colonel Arthur Penrith stamped snow from his boots and presented his ticket at the door with the bearing of one who remembered very different kinds of queues in very different places. "Roads will be impassable if this weather continues," he announced to no one in particular, his military moustache bristling with disapproval. "Council never learned the proper use of road salt." "That's because salt cannot be photographed for the parish newsletter," observed Dr. Edwin Haydock with gentle irony, removing his spectacles to clear the fog from their lenses. He greeted Miss Marple with a courteous nod. "You've chosen the warmest spot, Miss Marple. Quite strategic." "One must never be proud where comfort is concerned," Miss Marple replied mildly, her eyes remaining focused on her knitting. She had noticed how Iris's brooch sat crooked, the pin thrust through the fine wool without proper care. An upset girl does such things. A contented one worries about making holes in good fabric. The afternoon's charitable offerings, a fruitcake of impressive density, a knitted tea cozy shaped like a thatched cottage, and a ham of uncertain but hopeful origin, were displayed near the small stage. Behind them, a holly wreath had begun dropping tired red berries onto the polished floorboards. Through the steamed windows, the world had transformed into soft, white silence, beautiful and increasingly treacherous. He arrived just before 4 o'clock, shaking snow from the shoulders of a dark military greatcoat and scattering crystalline drops across the entrance like scattered diamonds. Captain Noel Strickland possessed the unmistakable bearing of a career soldier: straight spine, economical movements, and a crease beside his mouth that suggested familiarity with giving orders rather than receiving them. Someone in the queue whispered his name with a particular tone reserved for those who make others uncomfortable. "That's Captain Strickland," breathed Mrs. Parmenter, as though she had personally commissioned his rank. "Back from Germany last month. Working at Morrison's garage now, they say." Miss Marple observed the capable hands that accepted a paper cup of tea with automatic precision, like a man accustomed to taking whatever was offered on parade grounds. She noticed, too, the subtle ripple his presence created throughout the warm room. Colonels often harbor complicated feelings toward younger officers who return with unspoken secrets. Village girls grow nervous around men who might judge them by overheard gossip from years past. Iris Bell's fingers trembled slightly as she accepted his coat, hanging it with unnecessary care before wiping her palm against her skirt as though she had grasped nettles. "Foolish to venture out in such weather," muttered Colonel Penrith near the radiator's warmth. "Only a fool travels in conditions like these." "Or perhaps someone who has promised to meet someone," Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully, glancing up as Captain Strickland moved toward the back of the hall where the cloakroom door stood slightly ajar. There was a purposefulness about him that suggested not mere social obligation, but something more pressing, more private. The raffle drawing proceeded with the gentle chaos typical of village events. When Reverend Pierce called "Ticket 73," Captain Strickland for the donated fruitcake, heads turned expectantly. The captain, however, had vanished as quietly as he had arrived, leaving only his untouched cup of tea growing cold on a windowsill and a sense of unfinished business hanging in the warm air like smoke. The pause that followed Reverend Pierce's cheerful announcement of Ticket 73 stretched uncomfortably, like a smile held too long at a disappointing party. Mrs. Parmenter fluttered her spiral notebook with the nervous energy of someone who sensed her carefully orchestrated afternoon slipping beyond her control. "Perhaps the captain stepped outside for a moment," she suggested, though her voice carried a note of doubt that suggested even she found this explanation insufficient. "Without his coat?" Dr. Haydock observed mildly, removing his spectacles to clean them with deliberate precision. "Rather imprudent in weather like this." Colonel Penrith harumphed with military disapproval. "Damned peculiar behavior, if you ask me. One doesn't simply vanish from a social gathering without proper acknowledgement. Shows a fundamental lack of breeding." Miss Marple continued her steady knitting, but her mild blue eyes took careful note of how Iris Bell's hands had begun to tremble more noticeably as she collected empty teacups. The girl's rose brooch had somehow righted itself since the captain's departure, suggesting she had taken time to adjust her appearance, an odd priority for someone merely serving refreshments. "Iris, dear," Mrs. Parmenter commanded with the authority of someone accustomed to delegating unpleasant tasks, "do check the cloakroom properly. Perhaps the captain is feeling unwell." Iris nodded mutely and moved toward the back of the hall, her footsteps unusually hesitant. Miss Marple rose as well, murmuring something about fetching her muffler, and followed at a discreet distance. The cloakroom held its usual chill and the mingled scents of damp wool and floor polish. Captain Strickland's dark greatcoat hung precisely where Iris had placed it, a small puddle of melted snow spreading beneath its hem, like evidence of recent abandonment. What caught Miss Marple's attention, however, was the side door that led to the small yard behind the hall. It stood slightly ajar, a thin wedge of snow having blown against its base, suggesting recent use despite the bitter weather. Iris pressed her palm against the door, then quickly withdrew it as though the cold had burned her. "How very odd," Iris whispered, though whether she referred to the open door or some other discovery remained unclear. Miss Marple bent to retrieve what appeared to be a dropped glove, noticing as she did so a small rectangle of paper lodged near the doorframe, a Petrol coupon, its purple stamp blurred by moisture. She tucked it discreetly into her own glove, while Iris stood frozen by the door, her face pale with what might have been cold or something far more troubling. A sharp cry from outside shattered the afternoon's remaining tranquility. Dr. Haydock rushed past them through the side door, his medical bag already in hand. Colonel Penrith followed with military briskness, and soon half the village had gathered in the small yard behind the hall, their voices creating a confused chorus of shock and disbelief. Captain Strickland lay near the old wooden bench where the verger sometimes took his unauthorized cigarette breaks, his body outlined against the snow like a dark shadow cast by some invisible presence. The storm had been busy with its work of concealment, softening the harsh angles of death with a merciful blanket of white. Yet certain details remained starkly visible. The single dark notch at his throat, precise as a punctuation mark, the slight disarray of his collar, the way his hand had fallen as though reaching for something just beyond his grasp. Dr. Haydock knelt in the snow, his professional demeanor intact despite the circumstances. "He's been dead for some time," he announced quietly, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. This was no accident. The word murder rippled through the gathered villagers like a stone thrown into still water, creating widening circles of shock and speculation. Mrs. Parmenter clutched her notebook as though it might provide protection against such unthinkable realities. Colonel Penrith stood at rigid attention, his military training asserting itself in the face of crisis. Miss Marple observed it all with the quiet attention of someone who understood that murder, like charity, often began at home. She noticed the single hollyberry that had somehow found its way to the captain's shoulder, bright red against the dark wool of his uniform jacket. She saw how Iris Bell stood apart from the others, her hands pressed against her mouth, as though holding back words that might prove dangerous. Most intriguingly, she observed the faint transfer of red fabric fibers on the captain's sleeve, the distinctive nap of stage velvet that suggested contact with something theatrical, something deliberately chosen for concealment or disguise. "The constable must be summoned immediately," Reverend Pierce declared, though his voice shook with the knowledge that the storm had effectively isolated them all. "Though I fear the roads are already impassable." As if summoned by his words, the wind howled with renewed fury, driving the snow in thick, horizontal sheets that obscured the world beyond the village hall. Whatever secrets had led to Captain Strickland's death, they would remain locked within this small community until the storm chose to release its grip. Miss Marple tucked her muffler more securely about her throat and prepared to listen very carefully indeed to what her neighbors chose to say in the long, trapped hours that lay ahead. The wind drove them back inside like sheep before a collie, though Colonel Penrith and the verger remained stationed by the side door as an impromptu honor guard. Dr. Haydock had covered Captain Strickland's body with a canvas tarpaulin from the caretaker's cupboard, but death's presence lingered in the hall like smoke from a poorly drawing chimney. The storm showed no mercy. Each gust against the windows reminded them that they were prisoners of both weather and circumstance. Reverend Pierce emerged from the anteroom, shaking snow from his sleeves and wearing the helpless expression of a man whose faith in modern conveniences had been severely tested. "The telephone lines are down," he announced, his voice carrying the particular dismay of someone who had discovered that divine providence did not extend to reliable communication during emergencies. "I tried the exchange, the constable's cottage, even the post office. Nothing but static." Mrs. Parmenter seized upon this crisis with the efficiency of someone who believed that proper organization could impose order upon even the most chaotic circumstances. "We shall establish a timeline," she declared, brandishing her spiral notebook like a weapon against uncertainty. "Who saw Captain Strickland last, and precisely when? Dr. Haydock, you must examine everything again. Colonel Penrith, surely your military experience applies to such investigations?" "My dear woman," Colonel Penrith replied stiffly, his mustache bristling with military disapproval, "this is St. Mary Mead, not a battlefield, though I suspect we must assume the killer is among us, trapped by this infernal weather." His gaze swept the assembled villagers with the systematic thoroughness of a man accustomed to identifying potential threats. Miss Marple resumed her position near the radiator, her knitting needles moving with deceptive casualness, while her mild blue eyes took careful inventory of the subtle changes in the room's atmosphere. The initial shock was transforming into something far more dangerous: suspicion. Neighbors who had shared tea and gossip an hour earlier now regarded each other with the wariness of strangers. The hall's side door opened with a blast of cold air, admitting a man whose oil-stained overalls and worried expression identified him immediately as someone connected to Captain Strickland's recent employment. "Where is he?" Morrison demanded, unwinding a muffler with hands that bore the permanent stains of automotive work. "No, Captain Strickland. He left the garage just after 3, said he had an errand here." "I'm afraid he's dead, Mr. Morrison," Dr. Haydock said quietly, his professional manner intact despite the circumstances. "Murdered in the yard behind the hall." Morrison's face darkened with something beyond mere shock. He'd been having trouble lately. Questions about petrol coupons, accusations when customers' rations didn't stretch as far as they expected. People are quick to suspect theft when rationing pinches. His eyes moved across the gathered faces with the calculating look of a man who understood how quickly suspicion could spread. Miss Marple felt the small rectangle of damp paper in her glove, the petrol coupon she had retrieved near the cloakroom door. Such items possessed their own language of dates and denominations, the quiet arithmetic of wartime temptation and necessity. Young Tom Fletcher, who worked at the post office and possessed an unfortunate tendency toward dramatic revelation, cleared his throat importantly. "I saw Captain Strickland yesterday evening, near the church. He wasn't alone. There was a woman with him wearing one of those red velvet cloaks from the costume collection. They seemed to be having words about something." This announcement created a ripple of interest that spread through the hall like stones thrown into still water. The church's costume collection was kept locked in the vestry, accessible only to those trusted with keys. More significantly, Dr. Haydock had quietly mentioned to Miss Marple that red velvet fibers had been found on the captain's sleeve. "Could you identify this woman?" Mrs. Parmenter inquired, her pen poised expectantly above her notebook. Tom shifted uncomfortably under the collective attention. Too dark to see clearly, and the cloak covered most of her face. But they moved toward the churchyard when they noticed me watching. Miss Marple's attention focused on Iris Bell, who had retreated, to the corner near the stage where the charitable offering still awaited collection. The girl's nervous energy had intensified since the body's discovery, manifesting in small, repetitive actions, straightening the tea cozy, adjusting the holly wreath, worrying at loose threads on her cardigan. When Iris suddenly dropped her teacup, the porcelain shattering against the wooden floor with a sharp crack that made everyone jump, Miss Marple noticed the fresh scratches along the girl's knuckles, the sort that might result from handling something rough or sharp. "Clumsy of me," Iris whispered, kneeling to collect the pieces while carefully avoiding everyone's eyes. "I'll replace it, naturally." As Iris wrapped the broken porcelain in a tea towel, Miss Marple observed the red velvet curtains that framed the stage. The fabric's distinctive pile would cling to anything it touched, leaving telltale fibers as evidence of contact. The gap between the curtains was slightly wider on one side, suggesting recent disturbance. "The church costume chest was unlocked this morning," Reverend Pierce added helpfully. "I found it that way when I went to check the vestry. The latch is old, but still—" He trailed off, the implications settling over the room like another layer of snow. Miss Marple continued her steady knitting, but her mind worked with the precision of her needles. Someone had planned this carefully, using the storm as cover and the costume collection as disguise. The Petrol coupon suggested escape routes or secret meetings, while the red velvet connected the crime to someone with access to the church's theatrical properties. Most tellingly, the killer remained among them, hidden behind a mask of shock or grief, waiting for the storm to provide either escape or opportunity for further mischief. The afternoon light was fading rapidly, and with it, any hope of immediate rescue. They were truly trapped now, a collection of suspects and witnesses bound together by weather and murder, while somewhere among them, a killer waited with the patience of someone who understood that the longest storms eventually end. The shattered porcelain lay swept into a small pile near the stage, but its destruction had accomplished something far more significant than mere accident. It had shattered the fragile civility that had held the room together since Captain Strickland's body was discovered. The villagers no longer moved with the careful politeness of neighbors, sharing an unfortunate circumstance. Instead, they positioned themselves with the wary calculation of people who understood that one among them had committed murder. Colonel Penrith assumed command with military efficiency, stationing himself near the main entrance while his sharp eyes surveyed the assembled company. "We must establish a proper timeline," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to briefing subordinates on matters of life and death. Captain Strickland was last seen alive at approximately 4 o'clock. His body was discovered at 4:30. This provides us with a window of 30 minutes during which the murder occurred. Dr. Haydock nodded gravely from his position near the radiator, where he had been quietly observing the subtle changes in behavior that shock produces in different temperaments. "The wound was precise," he added with clinical detachment. A single thrust, delivered by someone with knowledge of anatomy or considerable luck. The angle suggests the killer was shorter than the captain, or struck from a position of concealment. Mrs. Parmenter seized upon this systematic approach with the relief of someone who believed that proper organization could impose order upon even the most chaotic circumstances. Her spiral notebook emerged once again, pen poised expectantly. Then we must account for everyone's whereabouts during those crucial 30 minutes. I was here supervising the refreshments, naturally, and witnessed the raffle drawing. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his oil-stained overalls, his weathered hands working nervously at the brim of his cap. The verger's earlier mention of petrol smell and fresh grease on the side door latch had not escaped anyone's notice, and Morrison's profession made him an obvious target for suspicion. "I was at the garage until just before I arrived here," he said defensively. "Mrs. Pemberton's Austin wouldn't start in this weather. She'll vouch for that, assuming the road's clear enough for travel." Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their steady rhythm, but her attention focused on the delicate interplay of accusation and defense beginning to unfold. She had observed that in moments of crisis, people often revealed more about themselves than they intended, and she was particularly interested in the way Morrison's gaze kept flickering toward Iris Bell with something that might have been concern or calculation. "The petrol smell the verger mentioned is significant," Morrison continued, his voice growing more heated. "Captain Strickland had been having difficulties over coupon allocations. People were making accusations, suggesting he was selling extra rations to customers who could pay premium prices. Such rumors can destroy a man's reputation, especially when rationing makes everyone desperate." It was then that Miss Marple made her quiet contribution to the growing collection of evidence. She carefully withdrew the damp rectangle of paper she had discovered near the cloakroom door, placing it discreetly on the small table beside her chair. "How interesting," she murmured in her gentle way. "I found this near the side door just after Captain Strickland's body was discovered. The date stamp suggests it was issued quite recently." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the wind's relentless assault against the windows. Every eye in the hall focused on the small petrol coupon with its blurred but still legible purple stamp from the St. Mary Mead post office. The implications were immediately clear to everyone present. Such coupons were precious as gold sovereigns in wartime, and their presence suggested either legitimate business or something far more sinister. Colonel Penrith examined the coupon with military precision, though his inspection revealed little beyond what Miss Marple had already observed. This could be significant evidence, or merely coincidental. Many people handle such items in the course of daily business. But not many people drop them in cloakrooms during charitable gatherings, Miss Marple observed mildly, her blue eyes taking careful note of how this revelation affected each person in the room. Unless, of course, they were conducting business of a rather different nature than tea and fruitcake. The atmosphere in the hall grew increasingly charged as attention focused on the two most obvious suspects. Morrison's connection to Petrol and his defensive attitude made him a natural target for suspicion, while Iris Bell's nervous behavior and proximity to the crime scene painted her as equally culpable. The girl had grown increasingly agitated since the body's discovery, her hands trembling as she attempted to busy herself with small tasks around the stage area. Miss Marple noticed how the villagers' need for a quick resolution was already shaping their interpretation of the evidence. The fresh scratches on Iris's knuckles, which might have resulted from any number of innocent activities, were being viewed as signs of a struggle. Her admission of being near the open side door was transformed from helpful information into damning testimony. Most tellingly, her obvious distress was being interpreted as guilt rather than the natural reaction of a sensitive young woman to violent death. Yet Miss Marple's experienced eye caught details that others overlooked in their eagerness to assign blame. The holly wreath that had fallen from the stage still lay scattered across the floorboards, its bright red berries creating a crimson trail that led her thoughts back to the single berry she had observed on Captain Strickland's shoulder. He had been near this stage very recently, near enough for the wreath to mark him with its color. The red velvet curtains that framed the small platform showed signs of recent disturbance, their heavy fabrics slightly displaced in a way that suggested someone had used them for concealment or quick passage. The costume chest in the vestry, Reverend Pierce added helpfully, though his clerical instincts seemed troubled by the implications. I found it unlocked this morning, which is unusual. Only 3 people keep keys: myself, Mrs. Bell, the cleaner, and Mr. Crumb, the verger. This information created another ripple of interest through the assembled company. Tom Fletcher's earlier account of seeing Captain Strickland with a woman in a red velvet cloak suddenly took on new significance, connecting the unlocked costume chest to the mysterious meeting near the church. Miss Marple continued her steady knitting while her mind worked with equal precision. The Petrol coupon suggested premeditation. Someone had arranged to meet Captain Strickland, possibly to discuss the very accusations that Morrison had mentioned. The red velvet fibers on the captain's sleeve connected the crime to someone with access to the church's theatrical properties. Most intriguingly, the killer had remained calm enough after the murder to return to the hall and participate in the shocked discovery of the body, displaying a composure that suggested either remarkable self-control or extensive preparation. As the storm continued its relentless siege against the village, Miss Marple reflected on the dangerous tendency of frightened people to seek simple explanations for complex crimes. The obvious suspects were rarely the correct ones. She had learned through long experience with human nature. The real killer would be someone who appeared shocked and helpful, someone who deflected suspicion toward others while maintaining an appearance of innocence. In the growing darkness of the winter afternoon, with the wind howling like a banshee around the trapped villagers, she prepared to watch very carefully indeed for the subtle signs that would reveal which of her neighbors possessed both the motive and the cold calculation necessary for murder. The afternoon light was fading rapidly now, and with it, any hope of immediate rescue from their increasingly claustrophobic situation. They were truly prisoners of both weather and circumstance, bound together by suspicion and fear, while somewhere among them a killer waited with the patience of someone who understood that the longest storms eventually end, and that survival often depends on allowing others to exhaust themselves in misdirected fury. The lamps were lit earlier than anyone preferred, their warm yellow circles creating islands of comfort that did little to dispel the chill seeping through the hall's old windows. Mrs. Parmenter arranged additional chairs with the determined efficiency of someone who believed proper organization could impose order upon even murder, while the spirit stove's kettle sang defiantly against the wind's relentless howling. The storm had transformed their charitable gathering into something resembling a siege, with neighbors eyeing each other across the lamplight with the wariness of people who understood that safety was no longer guaranteed. Colonel Penrith assumed command with military precision, positioning himself where he could observe all entrances while conducting what he termed a proper accounting of movements and motives. His interrogation began with systematic thoroughness, each villager called upon to provide their whereabouts during the crucial 30 minutes when Captain Strickland had met his death. "Reverend Pierce," the colonel began, his voice carrying parade ground authority. "Your movements from 4 o'clock onward, if you please." The Reverend shifted uncomfortably under this martial attention. "I was at the trestle table supervising the raffle drawing until approximately 10 minutes past 4. Then I stepped behind the stage to fetch additional ticket stubs from the storage box. The curtain hooks are troublesome. I may have disturbed the fabric while maneuvering past them." Morrison stepped forward with the defensive posture of a man who recognized suspicion focusing in his direction. "I arrived just before the body was discovered, Colonel. Mrs. Pemberton's Austin wouldn't start in this weather. She'll vouch for that when the road's clear. But there's something else you should know about Captain Strickland's recent troubles." The garage owner's weathered hands worked nervously at his cap as he continued. "He came to me last week asking questions about our petrol records. Said someone had accused him of selling extra rations, but he couldn't prove his innocence without examining our books. I told him to come back today. after this gathering, when we could go through everything properly." Young Tom Fletcher, emboldened by the systematic nature of the proceedings, added his own contribution. "When I saw Captain Strickland with that woman in the red cloak yesterday evening, they were arguing about money. Something about payments and promises that hadn't been kept." Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their steady rhythm while her mild blue eyes took careful inventory of these revelations. She had noticed something that escaped the others' attention during their focus on alibis and accusations. The holly wreath's scattered berries formed a deliberate trail across the floorboards, not the random distribution one might expect from a decoration that had simply fallen. Someone had stepped on the wreath, crushing several berries underfoot and carrying their sticky residue from the stage area toward the cloakroom door. "How interesting," she murmured, rising to examine the charitable offerings more closely. The thatched tea cozy drew her particular attention. It was considerably heavier than such items typically were, and when she lifted it with an admiring comment, the steam from her nearby teacup drew out an unexpected scent beneath the wool's natural odor. Something faintly metallic and sweet, like the ghost of Petrol in a cupboard that had once held emergency supplies. Iris Bell, who had been attempting to make herself invisible near the stage, suddenly spoke with unexpected firmness. Captain Strickland wasn't stealing anything. He was trying to help people, families struggling with rationing. He was investigating complaints about unfair distribution, not because he was corrupt, but because he was trying to stop someone else from being corrupt. This declaration transformed the afternoon's events entirely, casting Captain Strickland not as an opportunistic thief, but as an honest man whose investigation had made him dangerous to the real culprit. Dr. Haydock nodded gravely at this revelation, which suggests the killer had advanced knowledge of the captain's investigation and arranged to meet him here, using our gathering as cover. Miss Marple's attention drifted to the red velvet curtains framing the stage, their heavy fabric still showing signs of recent disturbance. She had also observed, during her examination of the tea cozy, a small pearl button caught in the curtain's hem, the sort used on ladies' winter gloves when appearance mattered more than practicality. Such buttons were easily lost when hands trembled with cold or nerves, and their owners often failed to notice the loss until much later. The storm continued its assault against the windows, but inside the hall a different tempest was building. The revelation that Captain Strickland might have been murdered to prevent him from exposing corruption had shifted focus from obvious suspects to more subtle possibilities. Someone in this warm circle of lamplight had arranged his death with careful premeditation, using the charity gathering and approaching storm to create both opportunity and concealment. As darkness settled completely over the snow-covered village, Miss Marple resumed her patient knitting with the serene expression of someone who understood that the most carefully planned deceptions eventually revealed their flaws when subjected to sustained observation. The holly berry trail, the anomalous tea cozy, the pearl button in the velvet. These small details were beginning to form a pattern that would soon expose not only a killer's identity, but the intricate web of deception they had woven around this quiet English village. The pearl button lay in Miss Marple's palm like a small accusation, its lustrous surface catching the lamplight with the particular gleam of something expensive and carefully chosen. She had extracted it from the red velvet curtain with the casual air of someone tidying a room, but her mild blue eyes had taken careful note of its quality and the fresh thread marks around its edge. Such buttons were not the sort one found on everyday winter gloves. They belonged to the kind of accessories purchased from London shops by people who could afford to consider appearance alongside mere practicality. Colonel Penrith, recognizing the need for systematic control over their increasingly precarious situation, positioned the verger at the side door while instructing Reverend Pierce to secure the main entrance. "No one enters or leaves," he announced with military authority. "We shall proceed by established facts and proper procedure." His sharp gaze swept the assembled villagers with the calculating attention of someone accustomed to identifying potential threats in hostile territory. Mrs. Parmenter seized upon this organized approach with the relief of someone who believed proper administration could impose order upon even the most chaotic circumstances. "We must secure all valuable documents and ration materials immediately," she declared, producing her spiral notebook with renewed authority. "I shall maintain custody of the raffle proceeds and coal voucher register in the alms box until proper authorities can attend." As she extended her gloved hand to collect the various papers and tickets, Miss Marple observed with quiet interest that Mrs. Parmenter's neat brown gloves were fastened with small pearl buttons, except at the left wrist, where a torn thread end strained tight as a whisker in the lamplight. The missing button's absence created a small but telling gap in what was otherwise an impeccably maintained appearance. Morrison stepped forward with the defensive posture of a man who recognized suspicion focusing in his direction. "There's something else about Captain Strickland's investigation," he said, his weathered hands working nervously at his cap. "He wasn't just looking into garage records. He suspected someone was systematically siphoning petrol rations from multiple sources. The post office distributions, church charity allocations, even some of the volunteer organizations. He kept detailed records of discrepancies he'd discovered." This revelation transformed the afternoon's events entirely, casting Captain Strickland not as a potential thief, but as an honest investigator whose methodical approach had made him dangerous to the real culprit. Young Tom Fletcher's face paled noticeably at this information, his position at the post office suddenly seeming less helpful than potentially incriminating. Miss Marple rose with the gentle air of someone admiring the charitable offerings, her attention focusing once again on the thatched tea cozy that had drawn her interest earlier. As she lifted it with an appreciative comment about fine handiwork, the unusual weight and faint metallic scent beneath the wool's natural odor became more pronounced. Something had been concealed within its innocent domestic appearance. Something that carried the ghost of Petrol and the suggestion of hasty concealment. Iris Bell, who had maintained her nervous vigil near the stage throughout these proceedings, finally found her voice. "Captain Strickland asked me to help with his investigation," she admitted, her words barely audible above the storm's relentless howling. He suspected the irregularities were too systematic to be accidental mistakes. He wanted to examine the volunteer rotas and allocation records to identify who had consistent access to ration materials. Dr. Haydock nodded gravely at this information. "The precision of the captain's wound suggests someone with anatomical knowledge," he added with clinical detachment. "The angle and placement indicate either medical training or considerable familiarity with such matters. This was not the work of someone acting purely from passion or panic." The implications of this medical assessment created another ripple of unease through the assembled company. In a village the size of St. Mary Mead, such specialized knowledge was not widely distributed, narrowing the field of potential suspects considerably while raising uncomfortable questions about trusted members of the community. Mrs. Parmenter's composure remained intact, though Miss Marple noticed how her gloved fingers had begun to worry at the torn thread where her button had been lost. "The suggestion that our charitable organizations harbor corruption is deeply offensive," she stated with righteous indignation. "Our procedures are beyond reproach, maintained according to the highest standards of accountability." Yet even as she spoke, Miss Marple observed the hollyberry trail that led from the stage area toward the cloakroom door. Not the random scatter one might expect from a fallen decoration, but the deliberate path created by someone who had stepped on the wreath and carried its sticky residue across the polished floorboards. The red velvet curtains showed signs of recent disturbance, their heavy fabric displaced in a way that suggested hasty concealment or quick passage. As the storm continued its siege against the windows, and darkness settled completely over the snow-covered village, Miss Marple reflected on the dangerous game being played around her. The killer had not acted impulsively, but had come prepared for confrontation, using the charity gathering as cover while systematically eliminating the one person who threatened to expose their carefully constructed deception. The evidence was beginning to form a pattern that would soon reveal not only a murderer's identity, but the intricate web of corruption they had woven through the heart of this quiet English village. The missing tea Cosy, she realized with quiet certainty, would prove to be the key that unlocked the entire mystery. If only she could determine who had taken it, and why they felt compelled to remove such seemingly innocent evidence from plain sight. It was Iris who noticed first, her hands hovering uncertainly over the charitable offerings as though searching for something that had ceased to exist. "The tea Cosy," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm's relentless howling. "It's gone." Mrs. Parmenter turned with the sharp efficiency of someone whose authority had been questioned. "Nonsense, Iris. There was no tea Cosy among today's contributions." Her spiral notebook emerged like a shield against uncertainty. "My inventory is quite complete and accurate." Yet Miss Marple, who had admired the cottage-shaped creation with its careful thatching and unusual weight, knew better than to doubt her own observations. She rose with the gentle air of someone stretching her legs, but her movement brought her to the small spirit stove in the anteroom, where an acrid thread of smoke had begun to curl upward. Not the comfortable scent of brewing tea, but something sharper, more urgent. Dr. Haydock reached the stove first, his medical training asserting itself in the face of potential danger. When he lifted the kettle's lid with a folded tea towel, the assembled villagers held their collective breath. Inside lay the charred remains of wool and paper, the missing tea Cosy, blackened and shrinking from itself, wrapped around a nest of petrol coupons that had fused together in the steam and heat. "Deliberate destruction," Colonel Penrith announced with military precision. "Someone attempted to burn evidence. Foolish to choose a kettle. The steam saved what the fire was meant to destroy." Miss Marple examined the sodden mass with quiet interest, noting particularly a small index card that had survived the hasty incineration. Its typed heading read, "Emergency Allotments, Review," with neat columns for names, parish files, and coupon serials. The paper's edge bore a faint smear of carmine, the particular shade favored by ladies who wished to appear efficient without seeming frivolous. "Those serials look familiar," young Tom Fletcher admitted, his face pale with recognition. "They match our post office records. If there's duplication, if someone took extras, we'd have documentation." Morrison stepped forward, his weathered hands working nervously at his cap. Captain Strickland suspected systematic theft from multiple sources, not just the garage, but church allocations, volunteer organizations, even postal distributions. He kept detailed records of every discrepancy. It was then that Iris found her voice with unexpected firmness. He was going to confront someone today, here at the hall. He had evidence, a leather ledger with everything documented. He said he wanted to give them a chance to explain before involving the authorities. This revelation transformed the afternoon's events entirely. Captain Strickland had not been killed to prevent random theft, but to silence an investigation that threatened to expose corruption woven through the village's charitable institutions. Miss Marple's attention drifted to Mrs. Parmenter, who maintained her composed efficiency while clutching the alms box with unnecessary firmness. The torn thread at her left wrist caught the lamplight, marking where a pearl button should have secured her glove. Miss Marple touched her own pocket, where that very button now rested like a small, lustrous accusation. "We must search systematically," Colonel Penrith declared, though his voice carried reluctance at the prospect of examining ladies' personal effects. The captain's ledger must be recovered. Mrs. Parmenter placed the alms box on the table with dignified cooperation. "Transparency is our only defense," she stated, though Miss Marple noticed how the box's weight seemed inconsistent with its supposed contents. Too heavy for mere raffle proceeds and voucher registers. As the contents were displayed with administrative precision, Miss Marple observed the subtle interplay of fear and calculation around her. The killer had grown desperate enough to destroy evidence hastily, using the charity gatherings' innocent domestic arrangements to conceal their actions. Yet haste, as she well knew, often proved more revealing than the most careful planning. The pearl button in her pocket felt warm against her fingers, a small but telling piece of evidence that connected the red velvet curtains, the systematic corruption, and the careful hands that had arranged both murder and its concealment. Someone in this warm circle of lamplight had built their prosperity on the systematic theft of wartime necessities, and when Captain Strickland's investigation had threatened their carefully constructed deception, they had chosen murder over exposure. The storm continued its siege against the windows, but inside the hall a different tempest was building. The killer's desperation was becoming increasingly apparent, and Miss Marple prepared to watch very carefully indeed for the subtle signs that would reveal which of her neighbors possessed both the organizational skills necessary for systematic theft and the cold calculation required for murder. The evidence was accumulating like the snow outside, small details that would soon form an inescapable pattern of guilt. The charred remains in the kettle told their own story of desperate concealment, but Miss Marple understood that desperate people often revealed more than they intended to hide. The acrid smoke had dissipated, leaving behind the unmistakable evidence of systematic deception. Petrol coupons fused together like guilty secrets, wrapped in the wool of a tea cozy that someone had hoped would burn completely away. Colonel Penrith approached the search for Captain Strickland's missing ledger with military precision, directing the assembled villagers to examine every corner of the hall with systematic thoroughness. "The ledger contains the evidence that led to murder," he announced grimly. "It must be recovered." Mrs. Parmenter maintained her composed efficiency throughout these proceedings, though Miss Marple noticed how the woman's gloved fingers had begun to worry more persistently at the torn thread where her pearl button should have secured her wrist. When the colonel's attention turned to the alms box that Mrs. Parmenter had guarded so carefully throughout the afternoon, she offered it for inspection with dignified cooperation. "Transparency is our only defense against such terrible accusations," she stated, though her voice carried a brittle edge that suggested the strain of maintaining innocence under increasingly difficult circumstances. The box yielded its contents with reluctant precision: raffle proceeds wrapped in greaseproof paper, coal voucher registers tied with string, church envelopes bearing the parish seal, and beneath them all, a leather-bound ledger bearing the unmistakable signs of recent handling. The book was damp at its corners and showed a faint smear of carmine along its leather strap, the particular shade favored by ladies who wished to appear efficient without seeming frivolous. Dr. Haydock examined the ledger with clinical attention, noting immediately that several pages had been excised with surgical precision. "The missing section corresponds exactly to the emergency allotments that were documented on the burnt index card," he observed quietly. "Someone removed the most damaging evidence." Yet Captain Strickland's methodical nature had provided its own protection against such tampering. The remaining pages revealed a comprehensive pattern of systematic theft that pointed inexorably towards someone with administrative access to multiple charitable organizations. Each discrepancy was documented with military precision, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence that no amount of careful record-keeping could explain away. Miss Marple rose with the gentle air of someone tidying a room, but her movement brought her to retrieve the pearl button from her pocket. She placed it carefully on the table beside the ledger, where its lustrous surface caught the lamplight with quiet accusation. "I believe this belongs to you, Mrs. Parmenter," she said mildly. "I found it caught in the red velvet curtains near where Captain Strickland met his death." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the storm's relentless assault against the windows. The small button lay between them like a bridge connecting Mrs. Parmenter directly to the crime scene during those crucial 30 minutes when murder had been committed. Mrs. Parmenter's composure, so carefully maintained throughout the afternoon's revelations, finally showed its first significant crack. "Anyone could have lost a button," she said, though her voice lacked its earlier authority. Such items are common enough. Indeed they are, Miss Marple agreed with gentle persistence. But this particular button bears a distinctive water stain, the same crescent-shaped mark I observed on your glove when you reached for the alms box. Such stains are created by very specific circumstances, leather pressed against wet fabric, leaving a permanent impression that no amount of polishing can entirely remove. The implications settled over the room like another layer of snow. Mrs. Parmenter had been present at the crime scene, had handled evidence with wet gloves, and had maintained custody of the very receptacle where the stolen ledger was discovered. The pattern of guilt was becoming as clear and inescapable as footprints in fresh snow. Young Tom Fletcher, emboldened by the mounting evidence, added his own damaging testimony. Mrs. Parmenter collected postal ration materials for distribution to various organizations. She had access to allocation records and knew exactly when extra coupons became available. Miss Marple observed with quiet satisfaction how Mrs. Parmenter's breathing had become more shallow and controlled, as though she were conserving energy for some final effort. The woman's eyes darted around the room, with increasing desperation, seeking an escape that the storm had effectively denied. "Such accusations are deeply offensive," Mrs. Parmenter stated, though her righteous indignation now sounded forced and hollow. "My administrative procedures are beyond reproach." Yet the evidence spoke with mathematical certainty. The pearl button, the water-stained leather, the systematic access to ration materials, and most damning of all, the ledger hidden within her own carefully guarded alms box. Each piece formed part of an intricate puzzle that revealed not only corruption, but the cold calculation necessary to choose murder over exposure. As the storm continued its siege against the village and darkness settled completely over the snow-covered landscape, Miss Marple prepared for the final revelation that would expose not only Captain Strickland's killer, but the web of deception that had motivated one of St. Mary Mead's most trusted citizens to commit the ultimate crime rather than face the consequences of her systematic theft from those she had sworn to help. The pearl button lay between them like a small, accusatory bridge connecting Mrs. Parmenter directly to Captain Strickland's final moments. Miss Marple picked it up with the gentle care of someone handling a butterfly's wing, though her mild blue eyes held the quiet certainty of someone who had finally assembled all the pieces of a particularly complex puzzle. "This little item tells such a complete story," Miss Marple began, her voice carrying the soft authority of absolute conviction. "Found caught in the red velvet curtains near the stage, it matches precisely the missing button from your left glove, Mrs. Parmenter. The torn thread at your wrist and the distinctive crescent-shaped water stain on the leather confirm this connection beyond any reasonable doubt." Mrs. Parmenter's breathing had grown shallow and controlled, like someone preparing for a final, desperate gambit. Her composed efficiency, so carefully maintained throughout the afternoon's revelations, finally showed significant cracks as the weight of evidence accumulated around her like snow against the windows. "The red velvet cloak that young Tom observed yesterday evening," Miss Marple continued with gentle persistence, "was taken from the church costume collection. Your administrative coordination between various charitable organizations provided you with access to those keys, just as it provided access to ration materials from multiple sources. The post office distributions, church charity allocations, emergency allotments." Dr. Haydock examined the water-stained ledger with renewed understanding. "The missing pages correspond to the most recent months," he observed quietly. "Someone removed evidence of escalating theft, larger amounts taken as confidence grew and opportunities multiplied." Miss Marple nodded with quiet satisfaction. Captain Strickland's military training in logistics helped him recognize patterns that civilian administrators might overlook. He understood how systematic pilferage could be disguised as clerical errors or bureaucratic inefficiency. His investigation threatened to expose not merely petty theft, but a comprehensive network of corruption that had been siphoning precious wartime resources from the very people you were sworn to help. The implications settled over the room like another layer of snow. Morrison stepped forward with grim understanding. Captain Strickland told me he suspected the irregularities were too systematic to be accidental. Someone was using their position of trust to skim rations from multiple sources. The tea Cosy was particularly clever, Miss Marple observed with mild admiration. Who would suspect a charitable offering of concealing stolen coupons? It provided the perfect method for transporting evidence away from official records. When Captain Strickland's investigation grew too dangerous, you attempted to destroy that evidence in the kettle, though fortunately, the steam saved what the fire was meant to consume. Young Tom Fletcher found his voice with growing confidence. The holly berries scattered from the wreath created a trail leading from the stage area directly toward the side door. Someone stepped on that wreath in their haste, carrying its crimson residue to the scene of the crime. A single berry was found on Captain Strickland's shoulder. Miss Marple's knitting needles had stilled completely as she delivered her final, inexorable conclusion. The wound itself was delivered with medical precision, a single thrust to the suprasternal notch, the soft area between the collarbones. Such anatomical knowledge suggests training that goes beyond mere administrative efficiency. You served as a nurse during the Great War, Mrs. Parmenter. You possessed both the knowledge and the steady hands necessary for such precise, fatal work. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the storm's relentless assault against the windows. Every piece of evidence, the pearl button, the water stains, the administrative access, the hidden ledger, the burned coupons, the medical precision, formed an unbreakable chain that bound Mrs. Parmenter directly to Captain Strickland's murder. He came here today not to expose you publicly, Miss Marple continued with gentle firmness, but to offer you a chance to confess, to make amends. He carried his ledger as proof, hoping for a peaceful resolution. Instead, you chose to eliminate the threat he represented to your carefully constructed network of systematic theft. Mrs. Parmenter's composure finally shattered completely. Her face contorted with raw, desperate emotion as years of careful control collapsed like a house of cards. "He would have ruined everything," she cried, her voice high and broken, startling everyone in the silent hall. "Everything I built, everything I worked for, they would have called me a thief, a cheat, after all I sacrificed. During the war, after all I gave to this community." Her confession hung in the air like smoke, confirming what the evidence had already revealed. The systematic corruption, the careful planning, the cold calculation necessary to choose murder over exposure, all had been driven by the desperate need to protect a facade of respectability built upon the betrayal of those she had sworn to serve. As the storm continued its siege against the village and darkness settled completely over the snow-covered landscape, the truth had finally emerged with the relentless certainty of dawn after the longest night. The killer sat among them, her guilt as clear and undeniable as the pearl button that had betrayed her presence at the scene of murder, while the wind howled its judgment through the winter darkness. Mrs. Parmenter's broken confession settled over the hall like the aftermath of a thunderclap, leaving the assembled villagers stunned by the magnitude of betrayal it revealed. The woman who had organized their charitable efforts with such meticulous efficiency had been systematically stealing from the very people she pretended to help, and when confronted with exposure, had chosen murder over disgrace. Colonel Penrith stepped forward with military precision, his training asserting itself in the face of complete moral collapse. "Mrs. Parmenter, you will remain seated while we secure the evidence," he commanded, though his voice carried an unexpected gentleness. The woman who had maintained such rigid composure throughout the afternoon now sat deflated, her careful facade crumbling like poorly mortared brickwork. Miss Marple rose with the deliberate air of someone completing an unpleasant but necessary task. "I believe we should understand exactly how Captain Strickland met his death," she said mildly, moving toward the anteroom where the charitable offerings had been displayed. "Dr. Haydock, would you examine this carving skewer more carefully? I removed it earlier from beneath the tea-cloths, where someone had placed it to soak away what evidence they could. The long steel implement, with its polished point and wooden handle, told its own story when examined under the lamplight. A faint crescent of carmine lipstick marked the handle's join, matching precisely the shade that Mrs. Parmenter favored for her efficient appearance. The wound was delivered with medical precision, Miss Marple continued with gentle firmness. Mrs. Parmenter's nursing service during the Great War provided her with anatomical knowledge that few civilians possess. The suprasternal notch, the soft hollow between the collarbones, is a vulnerable point that trained medical personnel would recognize immediately. Mrs. Parmenter's voice emerged as barely a whisper. He came here with his ledger, demanding I confess publicly, face prosecution like a common criminal. After everything I sacrificed during the war, 4 years nursing soldiers who died in my arms, he would have destroyed what little dignity I had left. The systematic nature of her crimes became clearer as Miss Marple explained the careful progression from small discrepancies to substantial theft. You began modestly, skimming excess allocations that might be overlooked as clerical errors. But desperation breeds ambition, and soon you are coordinating thefts across multiple organizations. Postal distributions, church charity funds, emergency allotments. Your administrative positions provided perfect cover. Captain Strickland's military training in logistics helped him recognize patterns that civilian administrators might miss, Dr. Haydock observed quietly. His investigation threatened to expose not merely individual theft, but a comprehensive network of corruption. Morrison nodded grimly. He came to the garage asking to examine our records, said he wanted to prove his innocence by documenting every legitimate transaction. He was trying to protect his own reputation while exposing the real thief. Mrs. Parmenter's final reserves of dignity crumbled completely. I offered him partnership, half of everything I had accumulated. But his military honor wouldn't permit compromise. He said I had one day to confess voluntarily before he involved the authorities. Miss Marple's mild blue eyes held infinite sadness as she delivered the final pieces of the puzzle. You arranged the meeting behind the stage curtains, using the red velvet cloak for concealment. The holly wreath provided cover for your presence near the side door. When persuasion failed, you struck with the precision your medical training had taught you, one thrust to silence him forever. The storm that had trapped them together was finally beginning to relent, its howling fury softening to exhausted whispers against the windows. As dawn approached, the sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of proper authorities. Constables and inspectors who would complete the grim business that Miss Marple's gentle persistence had begun. As Mrs. Parmenter was led away, her neighbors watched with the uncomfortable knowledge that evil could flourish even in the heart of England's most peaceful villages. The charitable gathering that had begun with such innocent purpose had revealed how desperation and wounded pride could transform even the most respectable citizens into thieves and murderers. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with the serene expression of someone who understood that human nature, like English weather, could change with devastating swiftness. The village would heal, as villages always did, but it would carry forever the quiet knowledge that trust, once broken, leaves scars that never entirely fade. Outside, the snow continued falling gently, covering the tracks of tragedy with winter's merciful blanket of forgetfulness. By mid-morning, the storm had exhausted itself, leaving behind a crystalline world where every branch and hedgerow wore winter's pristine disguise. The grinding sound of tire chains announced Inspector Graves' arrival with 2 constables, their official presence bringing the weight of proper authority to what had been a village's private tragedy. The inspector, a methodical man with steel-rimmed spectacles, listened to Dr. Haydock's medical assessment and Miss Marple's quiet recitation of evidence with the respectful attention of someone who recognized competence regardless of its source. Mrs. Parmenter sat with the rigid composure of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed entirely. She offered no resistance as the evidence was catalogued with official precision. The carving skewer with its telltale smear of carmine lipstick, the water-stained ledger revealing systematic theft, the pearl button that had betrayed her presence at the murder scene, and the charred remains of petrol coupons that had failed to burn completely away. The red velvet cloak was taken from the church costume collection, Reverend Pierce admitted quietly when questioned. Mrs. Parmenter requested access to the vestry yesterday evening for flower committee business. I'm afraid the costume chest must have been left unlocked. His clerical training in charity warred visibly with his shock at such calculated deception. Miss Marple observed the systematic resolution of each loose thread with quiet satisfaction. Iris Bell's scratched knuckles, which had seemed so suspicious, proved to result from straightening the fallen holly wreath. Dr. Haydock confirmed such injuries were common during Christmas preparations. The petrol coupon found near the cloakroom belonged to Captain Strickland himself, its serial number recorded in Tom Fletcher's post office logs. Morrison's garage books balanced perfectly, clearing him of any suspicion of complicity. Captain Strickland died trying to give her a chance for honorable confession, Morrison said heavily, his weathered hands still working at his cap. He believed in redemption, even for thieves. He carried his evidence not as a weapon, but as an opportunity for her to make amends. Inspector Graves examined the systematic nature of the theft with professional interest. The remaining ledger pages revealed a progression from small discrepancies to substantial embezzlement, each entry documented with the same meticulous care that had made Mrs. Parmenter such an effective administrator. "You began modestly," he observed without unkindness, skimming excess allocations that might pass as clerical errors. But desperation breeds ambition, and soon you were coordinating thefts across multiple organizations. Mrs. Parmenter's only response was to stare through the storm-marked windows at the white world beyond, as though seeking escape in winter's temporary transformation of familiar landscapes. As the constables led her away with professional courtesy, the hall seemed to expand in her absence, like a room suddenly freed from oppressive furniture. The villagers, who remained moved with the subdued air of people processing a fundamental shift in their understanding of their community. Neighbors who had shared tea and gossip now carried the uncomfortable knowledge that evil could flourish behind the most respectable facades. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with unhurried precision, the blue wool having grown considerably during the long night of observation and deduction. "I suspected something amiss from the moment I observed Iris's crooked brooch," she remarked to Dr. Haydock. "A contented girl worries about making holes in good fabric. An upset one thrusts the pin through carelessly, creating damage she would normally avoid." Colonel Penrith approached with military courtesy, his mustache bristling with what might have been admiration. "Your methods are unconventional, Miss Marple, but undeniably effective." "Human nature provides its own evidence," she replied mildly. Mrs. Parmenter's systematic mind, so admirable in charitable work, became her downfall when applied to crime. She could not resist keeping meticulous records, even of her own theft. As the villagers dispersed to their homes, Miss Marple walked slowly through the snow-covered streets, her boots creating neat impressions in winter's blank canvas. The morning sun climbed higher, promising warmth that would eventually melt the snow and reveal the earth beneath, just as patient observation could expose truth hidden under even the most careful deceptions. Reaching her cottage, she settled into her favorite chair by the window, where a brave primrose nodded from its tumbler on the sill. The fire still held its warmth, and Mary had laid the tea tray with thoughtful precision. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm while she reflected on the morning's bitter lessons. Captain Strickland had died as he had lived, with honor intact, trying to offer mercy even to those who betrayed trust. Mrs. Parmenter had chosen violence over the possibility of redemption, fear over the chance for genuine confession. The village would heal, as villages always did, but it would carry forever the quiet understanding that beneath the surface of ordinary English life, Human nature remained as unpredictable as winter storms. Outside, the last snowflakes danced past her window, delicate and ephemeral. The storm had hidden a soldier's murder for one long night, but it had also revealed the hidden currents of a community, proving once again that even in the most peaceful settings, the human heart remained an endlessly complex landscape where good and evil dwelt in uncomfortable proximity. Miss Marple smiled with gentle sadness and settled deeper into her chair. The blue wool flowed steadily from her needles, each stitch orderly and inexorable, like truth when it finally finds the proper thread to follow home.